What is the scariest place you've ever visited? The basement of Danvers State Mental Hospital, long before it was turned into apartments. There was a point where, in every direction the flashlight could reach, it was just more darkness. More empty darkness. We found a hallway where, as far as the flashlight could go, there were cages stacked on top of each other on both sides. My father worked for the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. He had to do an inspection there and came home crying about the way people were housed.
Can you provide any more detail on that? How were they housed?
There's lots of info online. Massive overcrowding, patients half naked in the hallways covered in feces with nowhere to go, people urinating in the halls, doped up to the point they were like zombies. A local newspaper or TV news, can't remember now, had gotten in and did an expose forcing the state to shut it down. This was about the time that Reagan started shutting down these institutions, and people who were here just ended up out on the street. There is a sequence in one of the last episodes of American Horror Story, Asylum. Basically, the main character returns to the asylum years after it's been shut down to film a news report. The asylum is abandoned and run down, dark as hell and still filled with patients that were just left there. The place is covered in dust, feces, and urine but still has life within, in the form of the severely mentally ill who have been left to rot and fester. That accurately portrays how bad the conditions were after asylums went through the general shutdown under the Reagan administration.
When did this happen?
The 1980s was a dark time in American history, comparable to other similarly dark periods. The Republican Party decided to defund mental health facilities nationwide in the 1980s as part of many Heritage Foundation recommendations to end the welfare state. This included outright abandonment of tens of thousands of people with severe mental handicaps or psychiatric illnesses that cannot be treated, and where patients cannot return to functioning in society. Of course, in 2024, Donald Trump has gotten the band back together, and so the Heritage Foundation is back at it. New for 2025 will be the further dismantling of the nation-state's fundamental responsibilities to the citizenry. The Provide for the Common Good clause of the U.S. Constitution explicitly states that it is the responsibility of the federal and state government to provide for those members of society who cannot meaningfully provide for themselves. I have family who were institutionalized. Some of the stories they told my father and grandparents were beyond messed up. My grandfather's cousin had a husband who had massive brain damage. He was slow but aware of everything and actually very intelligent, worked as an airplane mechanic. He couldn't talk right. His words were just word salad. To speak, he had to be sitting and speak slowly while making an effort on every word to make it sound right. He mostly wrote. He got picked up absolutely drunk, urinating outside as a man in the 60s often does. Cops arrested him then turned him over to an asylum after he never sobered up. For 3 months, they kept him in an isolated room, no pen or paper, and the stress made him talk worse. No one knew who he was or where he was from. His family, over 100 miles away, thought he died. At one point, he reached for a pencil on the table to write and had his hand smashed by a guard. The doctor was escorted out, marked him as violent, and put him in essentially a dog kennel like at the pound. The guy next to him was actually crazy and spent most of his time urinating, spitting, and throwing feces at his neighbors through the slots. At some point, he snapped and chewed through his finger, then used his blood to write his home address on the back wall, which is how people found out where he was. There are others. My grandfather's side had mental issues largely not helped by them going from very rich doing work for the Rockefeller oil industry to poverty in one generation. My grandfather's sister, for example, had a mental breakdown after being isolated by an abusive husband who then cheated on her while she was pregnant. She tried to self-abort, was successful, but labeled negatively obviously by law enforcement. She was also diagnosed manic, later found out to be mildly schizophrenic. After several weeks of basically being tortured, where she was left in a cold room with no bed or blankets and just a thin mat on the ground and nothing but a rope, or when an orderly beat her for stealing food, or when during a group session a woman bit her arm, tearing a chunk off, and then was refused medical care, or being thrown in a room with a woman that beat the shit out of her for not asking to be put somewhere else. Anyway, she tried to kill herself. She was found, stitched up, and tied to a table. That was where she remained for the next 6 weeks. She doesn't speak of it, but my grandmother heard about it later during a medical appointment. She brought her to that at some point during her time at this first asylum. She required a second abortion. A church group ended up sponsoring her and had her sent to the Quaker Friends group in Philadelphia, where she got actual help, a handful of meds, and was just the slightly odd artsy aunt until she passed in her late 90s. One of my grandfather's brothers was also sent to an asylum/prison where he died mysteriously. Said he ate rat poison but was beaten extremely bad to the point they had a cloth over his face in the casket, but they murdered someone and are not acknowledged by the family, so no one really cared to look into it. There are others. My grandfather's side had mental issues largely not helped by them going from very rich doing work for the Rockefeller oil industry to poverty in one generation. My grandfather's sister, for example, had a mental breakdown after being isolated by an abusive husband who then cheated on her while she was pregnant. She tried to self-abort, was successful, but labeled negatively obviously by law enforcement. She was also diagnosed manic, later found out to be mildly schizophrenic. After several weeks of basically being tortured, where she was left in a cold room with no bed or blankets and just a thin mat on the ground and nothing but a rope, or when an orderly beat her for stealing food, or when during a group session a woman bit her arm, tearing a chunk off, and then was refused medical care, or being thrown in a room with a woman that beat the shit out of her for not asking to be put somewhere else. Anyway, she tried to kill herself. She was found, stitched up, and tied to a table. That was where she remained for the next 6 weeks. She doesn't speak of it, but my grandmother heard about it later during a medical appointment. She brought her to that at some point during her time at this first asylum. She required a second abortion. A church group ended up sponsoring her and had her sent to the Quaker Friends group in Philadelphia, where she got actual help, a handful of meds, and was just the slightly odd artsy aunt until she passed in her late 90s. One of my grandfather's brothers was also sent to an asylum/prison where he died mysteriously. Said he ate rat poison but was beaten extremely bad to the point they had a cloth over his face in the casket, but they murdered someone and are not acknowledged by the family, so no one really cared to look into it. When I worked with the American Indian community in Los Angeles, I heard this story. A Navajo family brought their elderly father from the reservation for a visit. Somehow, they got separated, and he got lost in the big city. The old man didn't speak English, only Navajo. When he tried to ask for help, someone called the police because they couldn't understand him. They took him to the police station and brought in several language translators who arrived at the conclusion that he was speaking gibberish. They admitted him to a psychiatric hospital for 3 days before the family found him. I went to the Holocaust Museum in Skokie, Illinois, and stood inside one of the boxcars that transported people. I remember feeling the heaviness in the air. I just stood there for a while.
I visited the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. The entire experience lasted about 3 hours. It was completely silent. People walked through it all without saying a word. At the beginning of your tour, you receive a passport of someone who was in the concentration camp, and at the end, you find out if that person made it through. I had never been to a museum, not even an art museum, that was completely, utterly silent. It was a very heavy, sobering experience. I went in 2015 as part of a class trip. Spooky, sad place. As we were getting ready to leave, everyone was saying they felt drained, and some had heard voices or footsteps behind them, only to turn around and see no one there. I got caught on some tree branches twice, almost like the place was trying to hold on to me. I also felt compelled to pour out some of my water whenever I took a drink. I've never felt anything like that anywhere else.
I don't consider myself a religious person, but there is no denying the feeling you get at one of these places. I went to the Studhof camp, and the air was eerily still. You couldn't hear any birds or wildlife. It's as if nature just knows to avoid it.
Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum in Cambodia. I also visited the killing fields, but the experience at Prison S-21 was something else. I can't describe the wall of silence that washed over me from the first cell we entered. The rusted bed with arm shackles, the floor still blood-stained. There's a whole wall of photographs of the victims, and it really hits you. All these people with the same staring, traumatized eyes. We paid for a guide at the gate who was so gentle, informative, and eloquent. Toward the end of the tour, she told us about her memories from when she was 7, seeing her father murdered, watching her brother be pried from her mother's arms and taken away to his death at a camp, and how they managed to flee into Thailand, just the two of them. And then, stationed around the garden, are a few older men selling their memoirs of their time in prison there, and my brain just sort of short-circuited. It's not a history book, it's in living memory. It happened a stone's throw away.
Hayden, Arizona. Many of the houses are burned down or abandoned. It's an old mining town that's slowly turning into a ghost town. but a lot of people still live there. I've driven through there out of curiosity. It has a weird ominous vibe to it. From what I've heard, the police in that tiny town are corrupt, which kinda makes sense. The police headquarters is in an old bank, and while the town is falling apart, the police vehicles are brand new. There's a fire department with a completely burned down house across the street from it. How the heck is that even possible? I met someone on Tinder who catfished me back in 2013. I was a young college student and naive. The small college town I lived in had a 2-lane road heading into town and another one heading out of it, surrounded by cornfields and farmland. After some conversation, I got her address, and when I turned off the main road onto a dirt road with mostly cornfields, I saw a big house, a silo, a shed, and a guest house on the property. In the guest house window, I saw the silhouette of a man in drag waving at me to come in. It was nighttime, around 9 p.m., with only lights coming from the guest house and the moon. I quickly backed out and took off. It remains the creepiest place I've ever been and the creepiest experience. I used to travel my state frequently for work. I'd end up in these small rural towns and end up working until 8:30 or 9 p.m. most nights. I'd grab a quick bite then kind of cruise the towns randomly. They were always dead quiet by 9:30. At some point, I started exploring abandoned buildings in these towns because I was so bored. One night, I drove up to this old, abandoned hotel. It was some version of the old Holiday Inn Holidome design. If you aren't familiar with the Holidome, it's a 60s or 70s hotel layout that had a pool, mini golf, arcade, etc. inside with rooms on 2 floors around the perimeter. Kind of like an indoor resort. I pried off a plywood board covering the front door and climbed through the broken glass on the other side. As soon as I was in, I was creeped out and felt as if I wasn't alone. Not like teenagers party here, like there's something dangerous here. Listening intently, I didn't hear anything, so I pushed through the lobby towards the inner area. In front of me was the entrance into the dome area, and to the left and right were long hallways of rooms. I pointed my light down both and saw nothing but gloom and the detritus of better days. I stepped into the cavernous common area and was engulfed by darkness and stale, thick air. Very little ambient light penetrated this space, and I felt more vulnerable than I ever have before. I was surprised how intact the space was as I looked around. It was almost orderly. I made my way to the pool area. The fence surrounding it and the gate were intact, so I jumped over. The slide was still standing and clean, which felt off. The lounge chairs were still neatly arranged. I shined my beam into the empty pool. At the bottom of the pool was something weird and terrifying. There was a bunch of random stuff, not trash, but pots and pans, a pillow, pens/pencils, some dishes and utensils, batteries, etc. Just a mishmash. Here's the thing though, it was all laid out in an orderly fashion and covered the entire bottom of the shallow end. It was intentional but not organized, just rows of perfectly aligned things. Well, I got the heebie-jeebies and decided to GTFO. I vaulted over the fence and stumbled onto the ground. I heard someone f***ing laugh, a gibbering giggle that I couldn't see. Now, I'm trying not to panic and run blindly, but I was so f***ing scared it felt nearly impossible to keep my cool. I stood and tried to get my bearings in the dark, but this place was huge and I wasn't exact sure which direction was the exit. As I stood there shining my light around, I heard a door open and some rustling movement. That was it for me. I sprinted in the exact opposite direction of where I heard the noise. I got lucky because that was the right direction for the main lobby where I had entered. As I burst through the entry into the lobby, I saw movement from my right side. A body flew out of a hallway I had passed on my way in. A man wearing shorts only was in front of me now. Between me and my escape, he looked deranged and screamed mother and ran at me. I don't know why, but I ran straight at him in response. At the last second, I juked around him like Barry Sanders. I hit that opening to the outside without hesitation. When I looked over my shoulder, I didn't see him following me, but I could hear multiple voices screaming in what sounded like rage. I hightailed to my car and drove back to my hotel. I didn't sleep well and it was a while until I explored a vacant building again. And well, friends, that was all for today's video. If you enjoyed it, let me know with a thumbs up so that YouTube can share these stories with more people. Remember to hit the bell icon to be the first to know when we upload a new video. See you next time.